Hey guys, tonight we're going to take a very slow, very sleepy walk into the dim and slightly questionable world of medieval surgery. A world where, unfortunately for you, you probably wouldn't survive the hour, let alone the week. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there, because misery, after all, loves sleepy company. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing at the edge of stone corridor, the air cool and damp like a forgotten cellar, and every footstep you take echoes off the walls with an exaggerated clack, as if the building itself is trying to remind you just how alone and unsterile you are. There's a faint aroma floating around, a kind of earthy mildew mixed with something coppery, tangy. It might be blood, it might be mold. Either way, it's definitely not lavender. Ahead of you, a heavy wooden door creaks open on rusted hinges, revealing the place that passes, in this century, for a medical facility. A single tallow candle flickers on a shelf, dripping wax like it's melting in fear and casting shadows across the room in the shapes of things you really hope aren't surgical tools. A low fire smolders in the corner, more for heating instruments than for any real warmth, and a pair of leather straps dangle ominously from a narrow table in the center of the room. This is the medieval infirmary, and no, you're not here for a tour. You're the patient. Somewhere outside, a donkey brays, a dog barks, and a rooster crows, even though it's clearly not morning. Time, it seems, is as confused as you are. You take a slow step forward, your shoes crunching over rushes strewn on the floor, herbs and straw mint to cover up the mess of previous treatments. It's not working. The scent is something between butcher shop and very sad herb garden. You glance toward the shelf, where a curved knife gleams faintly in the firelight. Next to it, a small saw, a bowl, and what looks suspiciously like a collection of reused cloths. No one has washed their hands because, well, that concept hasn't been invented yet. Germ theory is centuries away, and so is soap that doesn't smell like animal fat and disappointment. A man in a linen smock appears, his hair sticking up in tufts, and his eyes ringed in dark circles, as if he's been awake since the Crusades. He greets you with a grunt and waves you toward the table. You hesitate. He grunts again. Apparently, bedside manner is also centuries away. You lie down gingerly on the splintery wood, and he immediately starts inspecting the wound on your leg. It's nothing major, just a small cut, the kind you'd throw a band-aid on today. But here, this could be your villain origin story. The man pokes the injury with what appears to be a feather dipped in some sort of greasy salve. It smells vaguely like garlic and something that once resembled wine. He nods to himself, then loudly declares that the humors are unbalanced. Excellent. You nod too, because you're polite, even when the diagnosis sounds like a horoscope. From a nearby basket, he retrieves a tool that might once have been a chisel, or possibly a spoon. It's hard to tell, and frankly, you'd rather not know. As he brings it closer, he mutters something about evil spirits of the blood and begins making preparations for what he calls relief. You're starting to sweat now, not from pain, but from the knowledge that the phrase "this might sting a little" hasn't yet entered the vocabulary. Instead, what you get is hold still, and if you feel faint, try not to bite your tongue off. The room is dim, but not quite dim enough. You can see everything. The tools, the stains on the walls, the other patient in the corner who's either asleep or not asleep. The table beneath you creaks ominously as the man begins his work, first by placing a wooden dowel in your mouth, like a chewy little appetizer to keep you quiet. Then comes the scalpel, well, the knife, scraping delicately, or as delicately as a medieval surgeon can manage, at the edge of your wound. The pain flares up like a bonfire, and you try to focus on something else. The smell of burning herbs, maybe, or the lopsided tapestry of a saint on the far wall. whose stitched eyes look suspiciously sympathetic. The good news is you won't remember most of this. The bad news is you're very much awake. You clench your fists as the cut deepens, and the man mutters approvingly at the sight of thick, dark blood. "Good drainage," he says, nodding, as if your pain is a compliment. You try not to pass out. Outside, a bell rings in the distance. Maybe a church service, or maybe a warning that someone just dropped dead of a cold. Historians still wonder if these early surgeons genuinely believed in their methods, or if they were just really good at pretending. There's debate about how much actual anatomy they understood. The average surgeon had little access to bodies for dissection, except for the occasional hanged criminal, which made for questionable research. Most of their knowledge came from books written centuries earlier, often translated from Arabic, Greek, or Latin texts that describe human anatomy using metaphors involving rivers, fire, and balance. The four humors ruled everything: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If you had a fever, it meant your blood was too strong. If you had a cough, it was the phlegm's fault. Depression? Probably an excess of black bile. Stubet somehow also humors. And so, the logical solution was to balance them, usually by bleeding you, purging you, or applying leeches in places leeches should never go. A lesser-known detail you'd probably rather not learn right now. Many medieval surgeries were done by candlelight during feast days when the patient was already a bit tipsy. There's evidence that villagers would gather for curative celebrations, where surgeries were conducted in public, sometimes even outdoors, with a crowd cheering on the surgeon like it was halftime at a particularly gruesome joust. The atmosphere was one of cheer, wine, and the occasional dismemberment. Meanwhile, you, our slightly less festive protagonist, are still lying on the table, the wound now stitched with thick thread made from either catgut or linen. Either way, sterile it is not. The surgeon blows on the stitches like it'll help them dry faster, and then, with a grunt of satisfaction, he slaps a poultice of mashed onion and lard onto the gash and wraps it in a cloth that might once have been a curtain. As you sit up slowly, lightheaded and leaking slightly, the man smiles for the first time. You've survived. For now. He hands you a cup of warm ale and advises you to avoid dancing, bathing, or sleeping on your left side for the next full moon cycle. You thank him. What else can you do? As you shuffle out of the infirmary on your good leg, you glance back one last time. The tools are already being rinsed in a wooden bowl of cloudy water. They'll be used again, on someone else, probably before lunch. You step out into the sunlight, blinking, dazed and grateful for the crisp, fresh air that doesn't smell like antiseptic failure. A rooster crows again, still oblivious to the time, and in the distance, you hear the faint sound of a lute being played terribly. You survived medieval surgery. That's more than most can say. You're hobbling now, favoring your recently stitched up leg like it's made of glass and medieval optimism, and the village healer suggests you rest somewhere quiet, which in this case turns out to be the back room of a barber shop. Yes, you heard that right. The same man sharpening a razor for someone's beard is also preparing to lance boils, set bones, and, should the need arise, amputate limbs. Welcome to the barber shop, where the scent of lavender shaving cream mingles with the metallic tang of blood, and the swirling red and white pole outside isn't a branding gimmick. It's an actual symbol of bloodletting and bandages. You sit down in the rickety wooden chair that groans beneath your weight. Not because you're heavy, but because this chair has seen things. Dark things. You notice a few stains on the armrests, maybe wine, maybe not. And the footrest appears to be propped up by a brick. The barber-surgeon, a jovial man with ruddy cheeks and the sort of hand you'd rather see holding a tankard than a scalpel, welcomes you with the kind of grin that says, "I've removed an ear or two in my time." He hums as he prepares his tools, lining up razors, scissors, a saw for the heavier jobs, he explains, and a small pot of boiling water that smells faintly of rosemary and rust. There's a kitten wandering near your feet, weaving between jars of lard, herbs, and something pickled that you hope isn't human. A customer in the corner finishes his shave, pays with a few copper coins, and casually mentions that his cousin had 3 teeth pulled here last week and only bled for an hour. The barber chuckles fondly, like at the family memory. You try to chuckle too, but your body is starting to understand that sitting in this chair is not unlike consenting to a medieval mystery box. You glance around and realize this place does double duty, not just as a grooming station, but as a literal surgical suite. It's warm, mostly because of the fireplace used to heat the irons, but also because the windows are too small to provide ventilation and too greasy to let in much light. There are bundles of herbs hanging from the rafters, meant to keep the air fresh, but they're fighting a losing battle against the stench of iron and old sweat. The barber taps a long, thin blade against the edge of a whetstone and asks how your leg is doing, then nods thoughtfully as you explain the swelling and the occasional burning sensation, like someone lit a candle under your kneecap. Ah, heat is good, he declares, means the humors are fighting. Fighting what? You're not sure, but your leg certainly feels like it's in a duel with itself. He then turns to another patient, a local farmer who sprained his wrist, wrapping it tightly in a strip of linen before reaching for what looks like a chicken bone to use as a brace. Resourceful, you think. Unsettling, you whisper inside your soul. As you wait, the barber tells you stories in between lathers and leeches. He once performed an eye surgery on a nobleman using a curved needle and prayer, though the nobleman allegedly now walks into walls. Another time, he drained an abscess from a cow that belonged to the mayor and was paid in pies. You nod along, hoping that none of these tales end in a phrase, and then I did the same thing to a human. The chair beneath you creaks again, and you feel something give slightly beneath your left thigh. Possibly the stuffing, possibly your courage. You're starting to realize that in this world, if you had a medical emergency, you didn't call a doctor. You called a barber. He was cheaper, faster, and usually in the neighborhood. And since most physicians were too busy reading old Roman texts and examining urine in glass flasks to get their hands dirty, the barber-surgeon filled the very bloody gap. The barber gestures to a faded diagram pinned to the wall, showing a vaguely human body divided into labeled zones: heart, liver, spleen, kidneys, and one area simply marked mystery. He explains that today's approach is all about balance. Restore the flow, drain the blockage, and trim the edges if necessary. You're not sure if he's referring to your wound or your beard, and honestly, neither feels safe right now. One widely accepted fact during this period is that barber surgeons were trained through apprenticeships, not universities. That meant they learned by doing, usually on people who couldn't afford better options, or who couldn't run away fast enough. In fact, some of them were considered more competent than university-trained physicians, simply because they weren't afraid to get their hands dirty. The barbers understood the human body through touch, trial, and occasionally error. Many served in the military, where battlefield surgery demanded quick decisions and quicker sawing. In fact, speed was often more valued than precision. The faster you could cut, the more likely your patient was to live, or at least not scream until the neighbors complained. Still, historians debate just how competent these multitasking hairdressers really were. Some argue that barbers were butchers with good public relations, while others insist they saved more lives than they took. A few even suggest that patients might have fared better under a barber's care than under the more theoretical treatments of elite physicians. After all, when one guy prescribes a bleeding and the other guy actually bleeds you, well, you get results either way. The real problem, of course, was that no one understood germs, bacteria, or even basic sanitation. So while your friendly barber surgeon might wash his hands in wine and wipe his tools on his apron, the likelihood of infection was astronomically high. Instruments weren't sterilized. They were warmed over the fire or wiped with a rag. Bandages were reused, and painkillers were rudimentary at best. Alcohol, opium if you were lucky, or a sharp stick between the teeth if you weren't. A quirky but true detail: Barbers were sometimes required by law to serve both grooming and surgical functions, and to display their surgical equipment in the shop window. Imagine strolling past a quaint little barber shop and seeing not just scissors and combs, but also bone saws, forceps, and a lovely jar of leeches basking in the sun like creepy little spa guests. In some towns, the barber-surgeons formed their own guilds and held demonstrations in the public square. Crowds would gather to watch a demonstration of skill. A tooth pulled here, a wart sliced there, a minor amputation if things got really festive. It was equal parts medical service and macabre entertainment. People even brought snacks. You shift slightly in your seat, trying to ignore the scraping sound of the razor being prepared, and glance at the man beside you, who's being bled from the forearm into a bowl decorated with tiny angels. You're not sure if the symbolism is ironic or tragic. The barber finally turns to you with a glint in his eye and announces it's time for a follow-up on your leg. He unwraps the cloth, sniffs the wound thoughtfully, not a method you expected, but okay, and declares it coming along nicely, though he says it with the tone of someone complimenting a moldy cheese. He applies more of the onion lard poultice and wraps it again, this time with a ribbon of red cloth, for warmth and style. You thank him because, again, manners are important when someone's hovering near your femoral artery. He offers you a peppermint, which you decline, and as you stand to leave, he pats your shoulder with a surprisingly tender hand. "You'll do fine," he says. "Just stay off it, eat warm porridge, and don't let a dog lick it." Sage advice, really. As you limp back out onto the cobbled street, the barber returns to trimming another man's beard, his blood-stained apron flapping cheerfully in the breeze like a flag of chaotic multitasking. You pass a child selling eels, a monk sneezing into his sleeve, and a rooster, possibly the same one from earlier, that seems to be following your entire medical journey with unusual interest. You survive the barbershop, and now, with a leg wrapped in hope and uncertainty, you head back into the village, where even the pigeons look like they've seen things they can't unsee. You've made it through the surgeon's table and the barber's chair, miraculously, and now you're gently ushered toward your next grand healing experience, the ancient and celebrated art of bloodletting. Yes, that classic medieval logic of, you don't feel well? Clearly, you have too much blood in your body. You're taken to a small, timber-framed hut tucked behind the town's apothecary, where the door hangs slightly crooked and the sign swinging above reads vital extractions and miscellaneous remedies. The floor is uneven, the air smells faintly of vinegar and moldy turnips, and a rooster, you're convinced it's the same one, sits perched smugly on the windowsill, eyeing you like it's placing bets on your outcome. Inside, jars line the walls. Some are filled with dark, sludgy liquid, others with dried herbs, and a few contain a delightful array of squirming black leeches just hanging out like it's their lunch break. The room is dim, lit by one weak shaft of sunlight squeezing through a cloudy window, and a few flickering rushlights that smell like beef fat and despair. In the middle of the room is a wooden bench with a bowl beneath it, strategically placed to catch whatever bodily fluids might flow forth during your treatment, and a pale cloth folded over the armrest, already stiff with old blood stains. You sit slowly because your leg still remembers the scalpel, and as you settle in, the physician, or at least the man claiming to be one, enters with a flourish, wearing robes slightly too large and a cap that looks like it was once a napkin. He's got the energy of someone who read half a book once and never stopped talking about it. He smiles, strokes his thin beard, and begins to explain the necessity of bloodletting in a tone that makes it sound as if he's reciting a bedtime story for children who fear balance in their bodily fluids. The humors, he begins, must be balanced. All sickness, whether it be fever, melancholy, gout, or dreams about goats, comes from a misalignment of the four essential bodily elements. He then lists them, again, as if you haven't already heard them enough to tattoo them onto your consciousness. Blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Blood, he assures you, is often too dominant, And that's why you're here. You nod slowly, pretending this makes perfect sense, while sneaking glances at the leeches swimming in their glass jar like they're doing synchronized swimming routines in a horror movie. The physician gestures toward them with something like fondness. "These are my assistants," he says. "They work tirelessly. No complaints." You smile weakly, unsure if this is supposed to be comforting or terrifying, and he proceeds to take out a small clay pot and begin warming it near the fire. He sprinkles in a mixture of herbs, sage, comfrey, and something that smells like old boots, then instructs you to roll up your sleeve. "We'll start gently," he says, a phrase you immediately understand to mean the opposite. He produces a small, curved lancet from a pouch at his belt, which looks like a medieval box cutter, and holds it up to the light admiringly, as if it's a treasured family heirloom. Then, without much ceremony, he gives your arm a quick nick. It stings, of course, but you're too tense to react properly, more focused on the feeling of warm blood dribbling into the bowl below. The physician hums softly to himself as he watches it flow. "Ah, very red," he notes. "That's good. It means you're alive." The thing is, bloodletting was shockingly popular, and not just with quacks. Even educated physicians of the era considered it the go-to solution for nearly everything. From headaches to hysteria, from indigestion to demonic possession, losing a pint or two of blood was seen as therapeutic. Kings were bled, popes were bled, farmhands and bakers and children were bled. Even people who weren't sick sometimes got bled as a preventive measure, like getting your oil changed before the engine makes a noise. But historians still wonder if anyone genuinely benefited from it. Was there a small placebo effect at play? Was it just the medieval version of getting your chakras aligned? Or did people just enjoy a nice, fainting spell now and then to break up the tedium of subsistence farming? The debate continues, and so do the leeches, because now the physician decides to up the ante by applying a few of the slimy little fellows to your forearm. You flinch involuntarily, but he holds your wrist firm, pressing the leeches gently until they latch on with a tiny popping sound. They begin feeding with the eager urgency of creatures that only get one good meal a week, and you feel a series of tiny, cold pinches as they go to work. The physician sits back, satisfied. "Nature's finest surgeons," he declares. "Clean, efficient, and reusable." You try not to think about that last part. Instead, you focus on the room. The wooden walls, the high shelves of dusty tomes and dried leaves. The way a spider is constructing a web between two bottles of tonic. One of the bottles has a faded label that reads, "Essence of Pigeon," and you decide not to ask. The leeches are still feeding, their tiny bodies swelling with your blood like uncomfortable water balloons. And the physician fans himself idly as he describes, in great detail, a case he treated last week involving a man who had a wandering spleen. According to him, it was solved with bloodletting, a hot compress, and prayer. Possibly in that order. You nod politely as your vision goes a little fuzzy around the edges. That's probably normal, right? You blink slowly, and the physician announces that the leeches are finished. He plucks them off one by one, dropping them into a smaller jar where they writhe lazily, now thoroughly full and no longer interested in you. Your arm is dotted with tiny red bites, still oozing a little, and he wraps it with a cloth that smells like thyme and mutton. You'll want to avoid lifting anything heavy, he advises, or thinking about mortality for the next few hours. One quirky fact: some households actually owned leeches the way we own vitamin supplements now. They were kept in small jars, passed down, and even named. In some towns, there was a communal leech keeper, basically a man who showed up with a bucket of them and a scale, charging by size and enthusiasm level. You consider this as you rise shakily to your feet, your legs slightly rubbery, your arm tingling. The physician offers you a sip of weak beer to restore the vapors, and you accept, though it tastes mostly like someone described hops to a bucket of rainwater. As you step outside, the fresh air hits you like a comforting slap. The rooster is still there, Of course it is. You've survived another chapter of medieval medicine, and the sun is beginning to set in that golden, dusty way that makes the world feel both peaceful and mildly apocalyptic. You sit on a nearby stone wall and watch villagers shuffle past. Some healthy, some limping, some laughing, some clearly fresh from their own recent bleeding session, their sleeves rolled up and bandages trailing behind them like victorious flags of bodily imbalance. You wonder, for a moment, if anyone ever questioned any of this. Surely someone had to think, maybe losing blood when I have a fever isn't helping? But then again, when it's all you've ever known, when the books, the healers, the local gossip, and the traveling monks all agree that the answer to everything is either bloodletting or repentance, doubt is a luxury. Maybe that's the open question history will never answer. How did entire generations live and die with such confidence in the wrong cure? Or maybe, in some strange way, the rituals and the repetition gave people comfort. At least something was being done, even if that something involved jars of worms and occasional dizziness. You lean back against the wall, arms sore but manageable, and let your gaze drift up toward the early evening sky. Somewhere out there, the stars are beginning to twinkle faintly, preparing for their slow nightly show. And somewhere closer, the leeches are digesting your blood like it's the highlight of their week. You don't feel cured, but you do feel quieter. And in this strange little corner of the world, that might be close enough. Your arm is wrapped in a slowly seeping cloth. Your legs still sore under layers of onion lard poultice, and your stomach, perhaps in sympathy with your other suffering limbs, has started to churn with a kind of medieval protest. But you're not dead yet, and that's practically a medical miracle in this timeline. You're led down a narrow dirt path to a small stone building attached to what looks like a monastery, though it smells less like sacred devotion and more like damp woolen feet. Inside, the air is thick with incense and something less charming. Probably the lingering odor of generations of infected wounds and the highly suspect remedies used to treat them. You're greeted by a monk in a brown robe with sleeves a little too long and eyes that seem far too excited to meet someone with a fresh wound. He clasps his hands, nods solemnly, and gestures for you to sit on a low wooden bench beside a slanted window that barely lets in light. You've arrived at the right place, he says warmly, then adds, though you should have come yesterday. Encouraging, he leans in to inspect your leg, his breath a curious mixture of mint and something that suggests he's recently eaten garlic straight from the bulb. Very good, he says, squinting. It's still weeping. You pause. Weeping? You ask if that's normal. He chuckles lightly and explains that, yes, the wound must suppurate. That means ooze, by the way. Pus is good. It's the body's way of expelling bad humors, he says, as if you just asked why the sun rises or why soup should be lukewarm and shared with strangers. You nod, unsure if he's entirely wrong, but not in the mood to challenge a man who probably has a jar of pickled toast somewhere behind that curtain. He fetches a thick, musty-looking book from a nearby shelf, flips through it with ink-stained fingers, and lands on a page decorated with both handwritten script and what you can only describe as a very artistic drawing of someone's leg mid-explosion. Galen says he begins referencing the ancient Roman physician whose word was still gospel nearly 1,500 years later. Galen believed that a wound that oozed and produced laudable pus was on the path to healing. If the wound stayed clean, they got nervous. Pus was a good sign. Pain was also good. The more it hurt, the more alive you were. Though if you were too lively about your pain, that probably meant your soul was impure. He gives your leg a firm prod with 2 fingers. You jump naturally. He smiles. Excellent. The pain confirms it's working. You're not sure what it is, possibly the medieval concept of immune response, or maybe just suffering itself. The monk hums to himself as he begins preparing a fresh poultice, made from honey, burnt rosemary, goose grease, and a sprinkle of dried moss. He mixes it in a wooden bowl with a carved pestle, then scoops up the goop with a cloth and presses it firmly onto your wound. It's warm and oddly comforting, even as it starts to drip a little down your ankle. He wraps it with a linen strip and ties it in a bow, like a festive, infected gift. He tells you that many monks and healers at the time believe in the harmony of elements. The body needed to expel its impurities, and nothing was more suspicious than a wound that healed too quickly. It meant the poison was still trapped inside. Pus, then, was the sign that your body was properly purging. This belief was so common that patients with clean wounds were often reopened or scraped in an effort to encourage healthy suppuration. You sit there quietly, rethinking all your modern assumptions about what healing looks like, as the monk bustles around gathering jars of other unidentifiable substances, some labeled in Latin, others simply marked with symbols that look like stars, moons, or possibly very enthusiastic worms. As he talks, he shares the story of a knight who came through recently with an arrowhead lodged in his thigh. The wound was deep, he said, and dry. They were quite worried until 3 days later, when it started to ooze green and yellow. We rejoiced, he said. The whole priory sang hymns. You asked what happened to the knight. He died, of course, he says, but the pus was excellent. He smiles at the memory. You nod solemnly and try not to cry. Pain, you're reminded, was also part of the diagnostic process. If a wound hurt, it meant you were alive and fighting. If it stopped hurting too soon, it could be a sign that death, or at least deep, irreversible infection, was on its way. Medieval healers had no anesthesia beyond alcohol, prayer, and distraction. Often, they'd encourage you to recite psalms or stare at a burning candle while they worked. Sometimes they'd hold your hand. Other times, they'd just tell you to bite down on a stick and hope for the best. The idea of comforting a patient or dulling their pain was a luxury. Pain was expected, even welcomed. It meant the procedure was necessary. It meant you were strong. And so, as the monk gently pats your newly treated leg, he tells you the pain is a gift. You try to smile, though you feel more like returning it to sender. A curious but true fact. One of the more widely used treatments for deep wounds was wound licking, not by people, thankfully, but by dogs. Monastery records include accounts of healing dogs trained to lick wounds, under the belief that their saliva contained divine properties. The monks swore by it. You glance nervously at the large, shaggy dog asleep in the corner, his tongue hanging out and his fur matted with questionable fluids. You decide not to ask. Meanwhile, your monk guide has begun preparing a drink. An herbal tonic made from mugwort, yarrow, and something that smells like boiled shoe leather. He pours it into a pewter cup and hands it to you proudly. It's warm and tastes like someone dropped a sock in a broth. It will strengthen the blood, he says. You drink it because you're already in too deep to refuse. Historians still debate whether the emphasis on pus and pain helped or hurt overall survival rates. On one hand, honey and some herbs had mild antibacterial properties. On the other, cutting open healing wounds just to make them leak again feels counterproductive. But medieval medical logic wasn't driven by germs or microscopes. It was shaped by centuries of inherited wisdom, most of it based on observation, trial, error, and a dash of hopeful theology. The four humors ruled everything in balance, restored through bleeding, purging, sweating, or suppuration was the ultimate goal. Medicine wasn't about comfort. It was about ritual, order, harmony between the body and the universe. Even if that harmony involved a leg that leaked like an overripe pear. The monk eventually leaves you to rest, laying a folded cloth beneath your leg to catch any drips. Outside, you can hear the soft murmur of prayer chants and the gentle clinking of jars. Someone is humming a hymn nearby. The light in the room shifts as the sun begins to lower, golden beams filtering through the dusty air, catching on suspended particles and making everything feel slightly magical if you ignore the wound. You let your head lean back against the cold stone wall and exhale slowly. You've been poked, bled, scraped, and re-bandaged, and yet you're still here. Still breathing. Maybe even healing, though it's hard to tell. Your body aches in that slow, radiating way that suggests everything inside is arguing with itself. And yet, there's a strange comfort in knowing that your pain is considered a positive, that your pus is praised, that someone, somewhere in a brown robe, is cheering for your immune system, whether he understands it or not. You've gotten used to the idea that every part of your recovery, oozing, throbbing, the occasional scent of burnt goose fat, means you are, by medieval standards, healing quite nicely, though your leg is now wrapped so thickly it resembles a very anxious loaf of bread. But the peace doesn't last. The monk from earlier gives your bandage a final pat, blesses your general leg area, and then gently informs you that if the wound worsens, meaning turns purple, begins to smell unusual, or attracts flies with above-average enthusiasm, amputation may be necessary. He says this with the tone one might use to suggest switching to herbal tea. You blink. Surely, you misheard. But no, he repeats it clearly. Amputation. And so, dear traveler, barely days into your journey, you find yourself facing the very real possibility of losing a limb at a time, where antiseptic is theoretical and anesthesia is mostly wishful thinking. You are escorted, hobbling and pale, to the home of the most experienced bonesman in town, a man known simply as Master Eldrick, though some whisper his nickname is the Slicer, which is less comforting. His house is near the blacksmith's forge, perhaps for proximity to sharpened tools, or perhaps because both professions involve heat, metal, and people yelling. The building is sturdy, smoky, and smells of boiled leather and ash. You step inside and are immediately greeted by a woman you assume to be Eldrick's assistant, though she's busy stirring a pot of something viscous and gray. She offers you a chunk of stale bread as a distraction while you wait. You chew. It tastes like hope's last breath. Eventually, Master Eldrick emerges, his arms dusted with sawdust and what might be bone fragments, his eyes bright and alert like a cat that's just noticed a mouse with a limp. He inspects your leg with professional detachment, prodding the swollen parts and sniffing the bandage, which apparently provides him with all the information he needs. You'll want to sit, he says matter-of-factly, and before you can even ask what he plans to do, he gestures to a thick, reinforced chair at the center of the room. It's padded with wool, probably for comfort, and fitted with thick leather straps, definitely not for comfort. You glance at the straps, then back at him. He smiles gently, like a man about to do something very unpleasant with excellent posture. His assistant begins heating metal tools in the hearth. Knives, hooks, tongs, and of course, the main attraction, the bone saw. It's curved, wooden-handled, with teeth like a very determined bear. There's no hiding it. This is medieval surgery, and you're about to become either a survivor or a cautionary tale. You're strapped in, not tightly, but firmly, like a particularly unfortunate roast. A leather strap is placed between your teeth with instructions to bite and think of a happy song. Your brain, ever helpful, can only recall the tune of a funeral dirge you heard last week. Master Eldrick takes a cloth, soaks it in wine, and presses it to your face. For courage, he says, which is charming, if inaccurate. There's no counting down, no sterile countdown or soft jazz. Just the abrupt tug of your bandage being removed and the cool sting of wine being poured directly onto your exposed skin. It burns, and you writhe slightly, already questioning your life choices and their proximity to open fires and men named the Slicer. Eldrick hums under his breath, a lullaby or possibly a dirge, and draws a line in soot across your leg, just above the knee. This is the border, he mutters. Anything below it is traitorous. You don't have time to ponder the poetic implications because the blade is already in motion. And here's a widely accepted truth of medieval surgery. Speed was everything. The faster the procedure, the higher the chance of survival. Not just because of blood loss, but because, without anesthetic, The pain could quite literally send someone into shock or death. Eldrick is fast, disturbingly fast. His saw grinds in a bone with the determined rhythm of someone sawing a stubborn tree limb, and the sound, oh, the sound, is a low, wet crunch punctuated by dry scraping, like trying to separate chicken from the bone with a rusted spoon. You feel it everywhere, in your spine, your teeth, your ancestors. You clench your jaw, bite down, try to think of anything else, but your entire world is sawdust and screaming nerves. It takes less than a minute, maybe less than 30 seconds, but time warps in agony. At some point, the assistant presses a red-hot iron to the stump to cauterize the wound, and your scream, thankfully, drowns out the sizzling. The room smells of smoke, wine, and singed meat. It's not a smell you'll forget. And then it's done. Your eyes are wide, your skin clammy, and your leg, well, it's in the bucket. Literally, a wooden bucket at the side of the room. Eldrick wipes his hands and gives you a nod, the kind that says, "You lived. Well done." He offers you more wine. You drink. A lesser-known detail of this procedure: the severed limbs were often kept for a while, just in case. There was a superstition that you might need it in the afterlife, so people would request to be buried with their missing parts. Some surgeons even labeled the buckets with chalk marks to keep track of whose leg was whose. You glance at the bucket, half expecting a name tag dangling from your former shin. There isn't, just your pale, discarded limb, looking oddly peaceful, as though it, too, is relieved to be done with all this. The assistant brings you a poultice to press against the stump, made of moss, pine resin, and powdered clay, followed by another strip of linen soaked in oil. You're rewrapped, rebandaged, and laid onto a narrow cot near the fire. Outside, birds are chirping, unaware that someone inside is now a fraction less human. The question historians still debate: did speed actually save lives, or was it simply the lesser of several very horrifying evils? Some argue that slower amputations were more precise and less traumatic to the body. Others point out that without painkillers, hesitation was a death sentence. Either way, the survival rate hovered somewhere between possibly and don't bet on it. Post-surgical infections were rampant, as sterilization was barely understood and antibiotics hadn't even dreamed of existing. The instruments, although wiped and heated, were rarely properly cleaned. Surgeons might move from patient to patient without washing hands, and blood from one operation could still be drying on the handle of the saw during the next. And yet, people lived. Not always, not often, but enough. Enough to make the risk seem worth it. You lie there quietly, drifting in and out of consciousness, half from pain, half from blood loss, and half because your body has decided that it needs a hard reset. The assistant sits near you, reading softly from a prayer book, though you suspect it's more to comfort herself than you. Eldrick is already at work cleaning his tools, muttering to himself about angles and sinew. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster crows again, of course, and you begin to wonder if the bird is a kind of spiritual mascot at this point. The pain is overwhelming, like being wrapped in fire, but oddly distant too, as if your body knows it can't process everything at once. You close your eyes. You've been bled, boiled, scraped, and now sawn apart. You're statistically a survivor, and you've earned a rest, even if it's only until the next fever. You wake to the distant tolling of a church bell, slow and solemn, echoing like a reminder that time marches on, even if you're now marching with one less leg. The fire beside your cot has burned down to embers, and someone has placed a damp cloth on your forehead, which smells faintly of chamomile and burnt linen. Your stump aches like it's still connected to the rest of your body, pulsing in angry confusion, as if the nerves are holding a protest rally. Outside, you can hear footsteps crunching over gravel and the occasional neigh of a horse pulling a cart far too close to the building for comfort. You blink slowly, your throat dry, your lips cracked, and as your eyes adjust, You find yourself not in Eldrick's smoky workshop anymore, but in a slightly quieter, marginally cleaner place. The town's hospital, or rather, the medieval version of one. It's more of an almshouse, maintained by monks and nuns, with a primary treatment method seems to be equal parts prayer, rest, and herbal porridge. The cot you lie on is hard, the blanket scratchy, and your only roommate is an old man sleeping 3 feet away, mumbling in his dreams about sheep. A nun enters with practiced quietness, checking the dressing on your leg with efficient, calloused hands. She hums softly as she works, her voice calm and gentle, like someone who's seen 1,000 wounds and isn't surprised by any of them. She tells you that you're lucky. Most people don't wake up. Your blood is strong, she says, like a plow horse. You're not sure if that's a compliment, but you nod anyway. This place is far from sterile. The floors are swept with bundles of herbs instead of brooms, meant to cleanse and scent the air simultaneously. Garlic strings hang near the doorways to ward off illness and evil. A few windows are propped open with wooden sticks, letting in the sounds and smells of the town. Fresh bread, manure, something frying in fat. There are 12 cots in total, though only 7 are occupied, each with its own bundle of blankets, a basin for spitting or bleeding, and a small crucifix hanging overhead like a spiritual nightlight. One patient groans in his sleep. Another whispers psalms between coughs. A young boy in the far corner stares blankly at the ceiling while a nun dabs his forehead. Welcome to Recovery, Medieval Edition, where rest is prescribed, but the main cure is the passage of time or divine intervention. Painkillers, if available, are crude at best. Wine, opium poppy if you're lucky, or henbane if you're desperate. You're offered a cup of bitter tea brewed from willow bark, which numbs your tongue slightly and tastes like someone strained it through a boot. It's not pleasant, but the dullness it brings to your aching stump is a minor miracle. You sip it slowly, grateful, and the nun gives you a lopsided smile before bustling away to deal with someone moaning about worms in the blood. And now begins the long, slow journey of healing. No more knives, hopefully. No more buckets of body parts. Just the day-by-day routine of keeping the wound clean, the bandage dry, and your spirits marginally above despair. The monks and nuns treat your injury with a blend of practical care and spiritual ritual. Every morning, a nun reads a prayer over you as she changes the dressing. Every evening, a monk lights a candle near your bed and murmurs blessings under his breath. You're not entirely sure whether the candle is for your comfort or a quiet preparation for your funeral, but you appreciate the gesture either way. The herbal treatments vary. Some days, they smear your stump with a mash of boiled comfrey and vinegar. Other days, it's an unidentifiable salve made of egg yolk, ash, and ground-up oyster shells. It draws out the poison, the nurse insists, though you suspect it might also draw out rats if left uncovered. Still, it seems to help. The stump swells less. The pain dulls. And you haven't screamed in 2 days, which everyone agrees is progress. One widely accepted fact about medieval hospitals: they were not centers of advanced medical care, but more like halfway houses for the sick and the dying. The church ran most of them, and healing was considered a spiritual process as much as a physical one. Care was free. Charity worked for the glory of God, but that care was limited by the tools and knowledge available. Bloodletting was still common. Diet was controlled. Clean water was recommended, but not always possible. And cleanliness, while valued, was misunderstood. People believed in miasmas, bad smells, as the root of disease. So they burned incense, waved scented herbs, and washed linens in lavender water. It was well-meaning, but tragically ineffective against infections. Still, within the limits of the time, these caregivers did their best, and they often succeeded in helping people recover, not because of their tools, but because of time, warmth, and kindness. That, and the occasional terrifying concoction of squirrel brains and salt, A quirky detail you overhear from another patient. Sometimes, to ward off infection, people would place a dead mole in the bed beside the wound. Draws the sickness out, he says earnestly, cradling a bandaged hand. You stare at him for a moment, wondering if he's joking. He isn't. You check your bed for moles, just in case. Thankfully, none. Still, it's a reminder that medicine in this time is as much superstition as science. One woman swears by hanging a chunk of amber around her neck to trap the bad air. Another insists her recovery only began after a visit from a traveling relic, a sliver of St. Cuthbert's finger, sealed in a tiny glass box, which she claims vibrated when placed near her boils. She might not be wrong, or she might have had a fever dream. Either way, it worked. Historians still wonder whether these hospitals actually improved survival rates. Some believe the structured routine and basic care, rest, hydration, wound cleaning, did more good than any specific treatment. Others argue that the close quarters and lack of sterilization made them breeding grounds for disease. But it's hard to deny the power of compassion, even in a grim setting. A warm bowl of broth, a gentle hand, a whispered prayer. These things mattered, maybe more than we can measure. And so you lie there, each day a slow motion crawl towards something resembling health. You learn the names of the other patients. You share a joke with the nun who brings your food. You even start to enjoy the weird tea. Outside, the seasons are shifting. The air has that crisp edge of autumn, and you can see the colors changing through the narrow window above your cot. Gold, red, brown, leaves curling like old parchment. Occasionally, someone enters with an injury worse than yours, and you feel lucky, even as your leg aches. One man arrives with burns from boiling pitch, another with a crushed foot from a horse cart. They moan through the night, and you offer your water without thinking. You're becoming part of this strange community of the almost healed and the nearly dead. And when your bandages are changed, and the nun says, "Looking better today," you believe her. Even when the pain spikes, even when the tea tastes like burnt bark, you believe her. One evening, a monk sits by your bed and offers to read aloud. He chooses a passage from a book of saints, stories of suffering, of miracles, of those who endured far worse. He tells the story of a martyr who survived being boiled in oil by thinking of God and kittens. You're not sure the kitten part is real, but it's oddly soothing. You fall asleep to the sound of his voice, drifting into a dream where your leg still itches, but at least you're whole. Recovery in this time isn't linear. Some days you feel strong. Other days you feel like melting into the mattress. But the wound closes. The swelling fades. Your appetite returns. The stump hardens, not with infection, but with healing. And eventually, you're able to sit up without help, to eat without spilling, and even, miracle of miracles, to laugh without pain. You're not cured, but you're not dying, and that counts for something. The day you leave the hospital, you're given a small wooden crutch carved from ash, polished just enough that the splinters won't get ideas, and adorned with a bit of ribbon that one of the younger nuns insisted would cheer it up. It's early morning, the sun still rubbing its eyes behind the hill, and the air smells like dew and baking barley. Your leg, well, what's left of it, throbs with every movement, a stubborn reminder of what's missing, but the monks clap your shoulder with reverence like they're sending a brave warrior into battle. The streets feel wider than you remember. Cobblestones underfoot shift slightly, and each hobbling step is an act of slow defiance. But you're upright, you're mobile, you're free. Sort of. What follows is the part of medieval healing rarely sung about in tales. The long, awkward, frequently frustrating adjustment to life after medicine, when the drama fades and you're just left with the aftermath. You pass the blacksmiths on the way out of town, Master Eldrick's domain, and see him sharpening blades in the courtyard, sleeves rolled to his elbows, his hands black with soot. He nods at you, gives the faintest grin. Maybe he remembers you. Maybe you're just one more limb in a long line of surgical trophies. Either way, it's a quiet kind of acknowledgement that you made out the other side, and that in itself is rare enough to deserve a nod. You keep moving, wobbling toward your next stop, the apothecary, because healing, as it turns out, doesn't end at surgery. Not in the Middle Ages. Now comes the balancing act of herbs, tonics, poultices, and superstition, all designed to help your body find its humors again. The apothecary shop is tucked between two larger buildings like a child squeezing into an adult conversation. Its sign, a faded mortar and pestle, sways in the breeze above a doorway barely wide enough for a determined goose. Inside, the air is thick with the scent of dried lavender, old honey, and a pungent undercurrent of what you sincerely hope is medicinal fungus. Shelves line the walls, filled with bottles, vials, powders, and small paper packets tied with twine. Some are labeled in Latin. Others have crude drawings, like a toad, a kidney, or something that looks suspiciously like a tiny ghost. The apothecary himself is a thin man with ink-stained fingers and a permanent squint, as though the herds have tried to outsmart him one too many times. He greets you without looking up, mutters something about barley mold and goat's lung, then finally sees your crutch and raises a brow. "Ah," he says, "post-operative restoration. Very fashionable." You explain that you're here to continue healing, maybe even strengthen what's left of your leg. He nods and begins collecting items from his shelves with the air of someone assembling a particularly confusing puzzle. A jar of dried nettles, a pouch of poppy seeds, a slice of dried liver, a flask labeled spirits of turmeric. You don't ask questions. You just hold out the little leather pouch of coins you were given by the monks and hope it covers whatever strange science is happening. He hands you a cloth bundle full of your new regimen, explaining each item with a blend of authority and mystical flair. "This is for strength," he says, tapping a bag of powdered root. "This is for dreams," motioning to a vial of blue syrup. "And this," he adds, holding up what appears to be a tiny glass bottle containing a single dried eyeball, "is for luck. But don't drink it." You nod solemnly, unsure if the warning is necessary or wildly insufficient. Over the next few weeks, you follow the apothecary's instructions with the dedication of someone who really doesn't want another leg removed. You boil leaves into tea, swallow bitter pastes, and sleep with various sachets under your pillow. One night you dream that you're flying. The next, you dream that your leg grew back, but it's made of bread. You don't mention that last one. What's most fascinating is how deeply embedded these rituals are in daily life. People don't just treat wounds, they rebalance themselves. One man tells you he cured his kidney stones by standing barefoot in a cabbage patch during a full moon. Another swears that sneezing into a hare's foot can clear melancholy. It's not that people are foolish. It's that when science is limited, creativity becomes essential. Every illness has a counterweight. Every affliction, a charm. And you, peg leg and all, are now part of that grand dance between nature, magic, and medieval trial and error. A widely accepted fact. Apothecaries were considered critical parts of the medical system in the Middle Ages, often consulted before physicians or surgeons. They blended medicine with botany, philosophy, and in many cases alchemy. Some worked closely with monasteries. Others were solitary figures, brewing remedies by candlelight and trusting their instincts more than any text. Many were women, wise women, herb wives, midwives, who were revered or feared depending on how successful or mysterious their treatments were. And while we might cringe now at the idea of swallowing boiled frog toes or smearing ashes on a rash, some of their concoctions were surprisingly effective. Willow bark really did reduce inflammation. Honey kept wounds clean. Even certain molds, if by luck alone, held primitive antibiotic properties. You become oddly fond of your daily tinctures, even if they taste like wet fence posts. There's something comforting in the ritual, the rhythm, the belief that every sip might help knit you back together. One lesser-known detail: apothecaries were also occasional psychologists. People came to them not just for wounds and warts, but for sadness, fear, and unexplained dreams. If someone suffered from melancholia, what we might now call depression, they'd be prescribed everything from lavender baths to a diet of warm apples and sheep's milk. You overhear a woman sobbing about the death of her goat, and the apothecary gives her a charm made from rose petals and crushed quartz. She leaves smiling, if still teary-eyed. Healing in this time wasn't just about the body. It was about the soul, the mood, the spirit. You're given a paste to rub into your temples whenever you feel overwhelmed. It smells like nutmeg and mint, and somehow it works. Maybe it's placebo. Maybe it's magic. Or maybe it's just the quiet kindness of someone saying, "Here, take this. I see you." Historians still debate the true efficacy of apothecaries. Were they genuine healers or just the best option available in a world of very few choices? Some argue that many of their treatments bordered on witchcraft. Others point out that, by and large, they filled a massive gap in public health, especially for those too poor to afford a surgeon or physician. Apothecaries made healing personal. You weren't just a wound. They asked about your sleep, your appetite, your moods. You begin to notice how your body is responding to the routine. Your sleep deepens. Your pain, while still present, dulls into something manageable. You find moments of peace, of reflection. You no longer brace for agony with every movement. And slowly, without realizing when it began, you start to feel like yourself again. One afternoon, you sit outside the apothecary shop with your leg propped on a wooden stool, sipping tea made from nettles and lemon balm, and watch the townsfolk go about their lives. Children chase chickens. A baker yells about stolen bread. Two men argue about the best way to fix a wagon wheel. It's loud, messy, alive. A woman passes by with a basket of flowers and nods at your crutch. "You're healing," she says simply, and keeps walking. You smile. You are. The worst is behind you, or at least the most dramatic bits. There may still be aches. There may be ghosts of pain that visit on rainy days. But your blood is stronger, your breath steadier, and your heart no longer flinches at the sight of linen and bone. You've come through the dark, not unscarred, but unbroken. And somewhere inside, something new is growing. Not a leg, unfortunately, but resilience, humor, maybe even hope. You adjust your crutch, finish your tea, and start the slow walk home. You settle into the rhythm of post-surgical life with a mixture of resignation, curiosity, and just a pinch of stubborn pride. After all, you're still here, which in medieval terms might as well qualify you for sainthood. Days roll into one another like uneven cobblestones, and you become intimately acquainted with the tiny nuances of healing. The way your stump tingles before it rains, how the crutch creaks more when you lean too far to the left, and the odd joy of simply being able to carry a bowl of soup without spilling half of it on your tunic. Your home, once a place you barely noticed, now feels like a sanctuary of predictability. The chair by the hearth becomes your throne. The windowsill, your weather oracle. Your days are quiet, but not empty. You practice balancing with your crutch while shooing chickens from the kitchen. You mix your herbal teas without measuring, trusting your instincts and your nose. You start carving little notches into the side of your walking stick, one for each week survived. The villagers treat you with something between reverence and pity. Children stare at your missing leg like it's a badge of honor. Adults glance politely and then offer you things: bread, cloth, boiled eggs, advice you didn't ask for. You start getting used to the quiet nods, the murmurs of "poor thing" or "lucky to be alive." And you smile through it all, because while you may be missing a leg, you're now armed with a story that can make even the toughest farmer wince and offer his best cider. The lingering effects of medieval surgery aren't just physical. You notice how your body is slowed down, how your sleep deepens and stretches, how pain now has layers: dull, sharp, sudden, ghostly. Phantom limb pain, though unnamed in this time, is real and maddening. Some nights you wake up swearing your foot itches, only to remember it's gone. Other times, you feel a jolt, like someone kicked your invisible shin. You mention this to the village healer, who tells you that such sensations are the work of unsettled spirits, perhaps your own soul mourning what it's lost. She gives you a sachet of rosemary and rue to sleep with, and while it doesn't stop the phantom pain, the scent is oddly comforting. Dreams come more vividly now. You dream of running, sometimes with 2 legs, sometimes with 3, sometimes not at all, just floating through the old streets like mist. You dream of Master Eldrick and his saw, except it's made of sugar, and he keeps trying to slice bread with it. You laugh in your sleep, or so you're told. These dreams, strange as they are, help in ways you can't explain. You wake up more at peace, as if the part of you that's missing is learning how to be gone. One widely accepted historical fact is that medieval communities often rallied around those who had survived such traumatic injuries. Whether from pity, superstition, or genuine respect, people would offer assistance, food, labor, protection. In some towns, amputees were seen as touched by God, their suffering symbolic of divine endurance. In others, they were given roles that suited their new pace of life. Keepers of the village gate, storytellers, scribes. You're not appointed to any formal title, but the local children start calling you One-Leg Tom, even though your name isn't Tom. The nickname sticks. At first it irks you, but then you realize it's their way of honoring your new identity, not just as a survivor, but as someone different, someone they now remember. You lean into it. You begin telling tales of your surgical adventures at the tavern, exaggerating only slightly for effect. You describe how the monk bled you with a feather quill, how Eldrick tied his saw to a rooster for good luck, how the wound sang hymns for 3 days straight. People laugh, wince, toast to your continued existence. You laugh too, and for the first time in a long while, it doesn't hurt. One lesser-known practice for those recovering from major surgery was the use of sound therapy. Chants, bells, even long, droning songs sung at the bedside to harmonize the body's humors. You remember a nun who hummed every time she checked your bandages. At the time, you found it odd. Now, at home, you catch yourself humming the same tune as you grind herbs, wash your linen, or drag your crutch across the floor. The melody worms its way into your bones, becoming a kind of healing ritual all its own. You start singing softly before bed, just a line or two, and the calm it brings is better than any tonic. Your neighbors notice. A widow a few doors down asks if you'll come sit with her sick husband and sing. You do. You hum awkwardly at first, but then the rhythm returns, and you see the man's face relax. Healing, you begin to understand, isn't always about fixing. It's about easing, softening, accompanying someone through the pain. There's an open question historians still debate. How much of medieval recovery was truly physical, and how much was psychosocial, based on the support and perception of the community? Did people heal better when surrounded by care, ritual, belief, and shared suffering? The records suggest so. You've certainly felt a difference. The leg may be gone, but the loneliness that often follows trauma hasn't caught up to you. You're too busy being needed, being greeted, being remembered. You become a kind of walking cautionary tale, but also a symbol of resilience. When a boy falls from a tree and breaks his arm, they bring him to you first. Go see One-Leg Tom. He knows pain. You teach him how to wrap a splint, how to chew willow bark without gagging, how to breathe through the worst of it. He calls you sir after that, and his mother bakes you a pie. One afternoon, you find yourself near the monastery again, where it all began. You hobble up the same steps where you once begged for help, your eyes wide with panic and your leg leaking like a cursed wineskin. This time, you're upright, scarred but whole in your own way. The monk who bled you is still there, older now, or maybe just slower. He smiles when he sees you and gestures for you to sit. You do. You both sip tea, no longer patient and healer, just two humans quietly existing. He asks about the dreams, the pain, the missing piece. You tell him, Honestly. He nods. He tells you about another man, years ago, who lost both feet to frostbite and learned to walk again using flat stones strapped to his knees. He prayed more after that, the monk says, but he also swore more. You laugh. You understand. The conversation drifts into silence, then to theology, then back to silence. It's the most comforting chat you've had in ages. Later that night, back home, you sit near your hearth, running your fingers over the carved notches in your crutch. 12 now, a full season. Outside, the wind rustles through drying leaves. Inside, the fire hums, the tea steams, and your heart, for once, doesn't feel like it's missing anything. The journey through medieval medicine has left you altered, humbled, a little crooked, but undeniably alive. And if survival is the best revenge, then you've won. The pain still visits, like an old friend who doesn't know when to leave, but you manage it. You wrap it in stories, sing it to sleep, drown it in nettle tea. Healing in this world isn't about erasing the wound. It's about learning to walk beside it, to carry it without letting it weigh you down. Time begins to flow in a slow, syrupy swirl, the kind that thickens the edges of memory and stitches soft days together without sharp corners. And before you realize it, you've entered a new rhythm, one not of healing, but of living again. The routines once dictated by pain and necessity become habits of comfort. Steeping your herbs with an absent-minded hum, adjusting your crutch automatically before turning through a doorway, sitting by the hearth just so, with your leg propped up and the cat you never really wanted snoozing at your feet like it owns the place. The seasons shift outside your door. Buds become blossoms. Blossoms become berries. Berries are mashed in a jam by the widow who still calls you dear, and then the leaves crisp up like the edges of old parchment. You mark the changes by scent and sound. The crackle of a new fire, the distant calls of migrating birds, the sharper bite of wind through the thatched roof, the way your phantom limb aches just before storm. People start coming to you more, not just out of curiosity or gossip, but for advice, guidance, maybe just to sit beside someone who's seen the inside of death's waiting room and strolled back out with one leg and a better sense of humor. There's a kind of unspoken authority that comes with surviving medieval medicine, especially when you've done it without going completely mad. Children bring you odd trinkets, a feather, a beetle, a pebble shaped like a pig, and ask you to tell them the story of the saw again. You oblige, of course, embellishing just enough to make their eyes go wide and their mouths form the perfect O of horrified delight. Adults listen too, though they pretend not to. They nod quietly when you speak, as if you're some kind of broken prophet returned from the smoky halls of Master Eldric's operating room with truths carved into your marrow. One day, a traveling tinker arrives, pulling a small cart stacked with pots, combs, bits of iron, and what he claims is a magic candle that burns upside down. He also carries a prosthetic leg, wooden, jointed at the knee, with a leather strap and an unsettling smile carved into the side. You stare at it, unsure whether to be intrigued or offended. He sees your look and offers to let you try it. At first, the idea seems absurd. You've made peace with the crutch, after all. It's reliable, shaped by your hand, worn into submission. But the tinker insists, and you find yourself strapping on this bizarre contraption while half the village watches from a respectful distance, pretending to sweep doorsteps and stir porridge. The leg is strange. Heavy, stiff, but almost functional. You take 2 steps, wobble, and crash into the side of the well. Everyone applauds like you've just won a tournament. You laugh. The tinker laughs. The baker offers you half a loaf of rye bread as a reward. The prosthetic is crude, yes, but it opens a door in your mind you hadn't realized was still closed. What if you could move differently again? What if you didn't have to lean forever? That night, lying in bed, you run your hands over the new limb's surface, feeling the grooves of the carved smile. You think of it less as a replacement and more as a companion, a new, awkward limb with its own personality. Historically, The concept of prosthetics in the medieval world was surprisingly advanced, though rarely practical for common folk. Most were made of wood or metal, designed more for appearance than function. Knights who lost limbs in battle sometimes commissioned ornate replacements. Arms that could hold a shield, legs that could perch on a horse stirrup, even hands with spring-loaded fingers for holding quills or goblets. But for peasants like you, prosthetics were a curiosity at best, which makes the tinker's gift feel oddly luxurious. A symbol that you've crossed some invisible threshold from poor injured soul to resourceful local legend. You begin using the leg during short walks, leaving the crutch by the door as a backup. It's not comfortable. It creaks. It pinches. It makes a sound like a duck choking on a kazoo every time you take a sharp turn. But it also gives you a different posture, one that says, "Look, I'm still upright," and "I'm not done yet." The village responds accordingly. The children name your legs Stumpy. The older men at the tavern raise their mugs when you walk in, nodding as if to say, "Ah yes, the wooden warrior returns." You lean into the joke, carving tiny runes into the prosthetic, adding a strap of dyed cloth for flair. It becomes a part of you, not just physically, but symbolically, proof that medieval medicine may have taken something, but you took something back. One lesser known but curious tradition from this era involves blessing replacement limbs. Superstition held that a limb without a soul might attract mischievous spirits, gremlins, imps, or ghosts looking for a vessel. So villagers would gather, burn sweet herbs, chant nonsense prayers, and rub the prosthetic with holy oil or even onion juice. You don't go quite that far, but when the local priest offers to baptize your new leg during Sunday Mass, you agree, mostly for the novelty. The ritual is brief but heartfelt. He sprinkles it with water, mutters something in Latin, and ends by tapping the wooden knee with a small crucifix. "May your steps be guided," he says. Later, someone claims your limp is noticeably improved. Whether it's divine intervention or just muscle memory, you're not sure. But you keep walking, and yet, despite your progress, a certain restlessness begins to build in your chest, like a bird trapped under your ribs. You've survived, adapted, found comfort in routine. But you've also become a story, a fixture, a local curiosity, and part of you wonders what lies beyond the village fields and forests. You remember the sound of the surgeon's saw, not with fear, but with strange reverence. You remember the nuns humming, the scent of poultices, the whisper of your name as it passed through corridors of the hospital. You remember being changed. And that change, it didn't just take a leg. It gave you a hunger. Not for excitement, not exactly, but for meaning, for movement, for something more. So one morning, without fanfare, you pack a small satchel, a loaf of bread, a wedge of cheese, your teas and tinctures, and a small wooden carving shaped like your old foot, a gift from a child. So you don't forget where it went. You strap on your wooden leg, fasten your cloak, and leave a note on your door. Gone walking. Historians still argue about how much mobility disabled people had in the medieval world. Some suggest they were hidden away, pitted, forgotten. Others believe they traveled far, told stories, became healers, saints, even leaders. You like to imagine they did all of it. That somewhere out there was a man with one eye and a staff, crossing rivers to deliver herbs to the sick. That a woman with a twisted spine became the most sought-after midwife in 5 towns. That people like you didn't just recover, they expanded. And so you walk, slowly, unevenly, stubbornly, into the wider world. You pass towns where no one knows your name, where people stare at your leg and then quickly look away. You sleep under trees beside barns, in inns where the straw pokes through the mattress like judgment. You barter herbs for food, tell stories for shelter, trade a joke for a warm bowl of stew. And everywhere you go, people ask, "What happened to your leg?" And you smile, and you tell them. You've walked so far now that the road no longer feels foreign, but like a thread you've been stitching into the fabric of your new life. Awkward and uneven, but undeniably yours. Your crutch, now slung over your shoulder more than it's used, still bears the marks of those early, painful days. The worn leather grip, the nick in the handle from that time you slipped on a frozen puddle outside Sheep Pen. The faded ribbon that one of the monastery nuns had tied on before you left. Your wooden leg, Stumpy, as the children so affectionately named it, has become an extension of you, groaning under your weight with every step like an old friend who never lets you forget how far you've come. The open road stretches ahead, not with grandeur, but with the quiet persistence of possibility. Fields give way to forests. Villages blur into crossroads. And every new town you hobble into brings a mixture of stares, welcomes, and the same old question: what happened to your leg? Sometimes you give them the simple answer: surgery, bad luck, a nasty infection. Other times you lean in, raise an eyebrow, and begin the tale of Eldrick the bloodthirsty blacksmith, of nuns who sang over bandages, of an apothecary who tried to fix your spleen with thistle wine and powdered crab shell. You never tell the story the same way twice. That's the privilege of the survivor. You own your scars, and you get to choose how the world sees them. Eventually, you stumble upon a market town much larger than any you've passed through. The air buzzes with life. Vendors shouting over one another about onions and eels, children darting between carts like foxes in a chicken coop, and the clang of metal on metal echoing from a nearby forge. The sound makes you pause, hand resting instinctively on your hip where your leg used to be. For a moment, you're back there, back on Eldrick's bench, smelling singed hair and hearing the wheeze of his bellows. You shake it off. Not every blacksmith is a butcher. Probably. You make your way through the crowd, slower than most, but still steady, until you spot something unexpected. A small wooden sign that reads, in uneven letters, "Lectures and Oddities, Storyteller Needed." You laugh out loud, which earns a confused glance from a passing merchant. But it feels like a sign, not just literally, but cosmically. You step inside. The space smells like beeswax, old parchment, and something herbal, a scent you've come to associate with healing, memory, and mild disappointment. Inside, there's a wiry woman with gray hair in a braid that loops around her head like a crown. She looks you over, her eyes pausing at your leg, then your crutch, then back to your eyes. "You have stories," she says flatly, "and I need someone who can speak without putting people to sleep." You grin. "I can't promise anything," you reply, "but I did survive medieval surgery. That ought to count for something." And so you settle into yet another life, a new rhythm, this time not of pain or healing, but of teaching. You become a teller of tales, a keeper of truths dressed in fiction, a chronicler of what it really meant to be stitched up, bled dry, bandaged, blessed, and sent limping back into the world. You sit on a stool in the middle of the room, legs stretched awkwardly to one side, a mug of something warm and mildly alcoholic in your hand, and you speak. People listen. Children with wide eyes and runny noses, travelers with sore backs and full bellies, old men who nod at all the right moments. You tell them about the burning cloth, about the chants and charms, about the apothecary who offered you dried mole meat to draw out the heat spirits. And somewhere between the laughs and the winces, people begin to understand what you already learned the hard way. That survival isn't always loud, that bravery isn't always dramatic, and that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is live through the ordinary horrors and come out the other side with their humor intact. Occasionally, someone lingers after the story's done, asking questions. What does the pain feel like? Does it still ache when it rains? Do you ever dream you have both legs again? You answer as best you can, sometimes truthfully, sometimes kindly, occasionally both. A widely accepted truth among historians is that much of what we know about pain, recovery, and resilience in the Middle Ages comes not from medical texts, but from stories, from letters, plays, poems, and rumors passed along tavern benches and monastery gardens. That's where the real medicine lives, in shared experience, in witness, in memory. And now you are part of that lineage. You are not a knight, not a priest, not a scholar, but you're living proof of something greater than any title. You are the record keeper of your own suffering, the guardian of a story no one else could have told. Your wooden leg becomes both symbol and tool. You tap it thoughtfully when speaking, use it to prop up scrolls, let children knock on it for luck before exams. It becomes a communal object, part relic, part joke, part reminder. And maybe that's what healing really is, not just the mending of skin and sinew, but the reweaving of your story into the world's fabric in a way that others can touch. One lesser-known cultural practice from this period involves the notion of wound wisdom, the idea that people who had suffered great injuries were uniquely gifted in matters of truth, character, and guidance. In some villages, wounded veterans were invited to settle disputes or bless crops, as if pain had unlocked a deeper sight. You, of course, aren't sure about all that. But it does explain why people keep asking you to weigh in on things that have nothing to do with medicine. Whose cow gave the best milk? Whether God minds if someone eats eels during Lent? If dreams about fish mean your mother-in-law is plotting against you? You answer, not because you know, but because people want to believe you do. And somehow, that belief makes you braver. So you give them answers, always with a shrug, a smile, and a nudge of your creaking leg. Historians still wonder whether survivors like you were truly honored or merely tolerated in their time. Was the admiration real, or a polite mask over discomfort? Were you a beacon or a burden? You think about that sometimes, late at night, with the fire low and your body humming in the dark like a half-forgotten song. But mostly, you think about the people who helped you get here. The nun who called you a plow horse, the boy who gave you a carving of your lost foot, the apothecary who may have accidentally made you hallucinate a conversation with cabbage. They were all pieces of the journey. And so you carry them forward, stitched into your stories, embedded in every word you offer to the next listener, the next child, the next soul standing just outside pain, wondering if they'll make it through. One evening, as autumn slips quietly into winter, and frost begins to lace the edges of windows like nature's own embroidery, you're asked to speak at the town's feast of remembrance. It's a small thing, a gathering of food, music, and murmured names for those who've passed. You sit before the crowd, wrapped in a cloak that smells of wood smoke and thyme, your leg aching in that familiar, almost fond way. You tell them a story, not of loss, but of endurance. You describe the sensation of being sewn up with gut string, of learning to balance, of learning to laugh again. And then, just as the fire crackles louder, you let the story settle into silence. No dramatic end, no applause, just the soft understanding that everyone, in their own way, has a wound they're still learning to walk with. The crowd disperses slowly, many pausing to touch your shoulder, to press a hand to your carved crutch, to say thank you without words. You sit there a while longer, watching the smoke rise, listening to the wind shift, and letting the quiet settle over you like a blanket. Now, as the fire dies down and the last embers settle into a soft orange glow, you feel the weight of the day finally ease from your shoulders. The room around you grows quieter, the world softening at the edges, like a painting left out in the rain. Colors fading into gentle grays, lines no longer sharp, but calm and blurred. You lean back in your chair, your good leg stretched forward, your wooden one resting beside it like a faithful companion, and close your eyes. There's a distant hush of wind outside, brushing past the shutters, and somewhere not too far off, a dog gives one lazy bark before curling in on itself for the night. Even your aches feel gentler now, like old friends who've learned to whisper. You listen to your own breathing, slow, even unhurried, and let your mind drift through the story you've carried. The saw, the songs, the soft scent of herbs. You've traveled far tonight, across fields and forests, through holes of healing and strange concoctions, through pain and past it into something softer. Let yourself rest now. You've earned it. Let the story dissolve behind your eyelids. like smoke curling up into a starless sky. Imagine the flickering torchlight from the monastery fading to moonlight on cobblestones. Picture your old crutch leaning against a stone wall, your prosthetic leg set beside a roaring hearth, steam curling from a forgotten cup of tea. Let the warmth wrap around you like a thick woolen cloak, and let every sound, every creak of timber, every sleepy sigh of the house remind you that you are safe, you are home, and you are whole in all the ways that truly matter. The road is quiet now. There are no more stories to tell. Just this stillness, this breath, this moment. Let yourself slip into it, gently, like stepping into calm water. No need to fight the tide. No need to chase another thought. Just rest in this small, sacred quiet.